Hi, and welcome to the Olive Branch Community Church. My name is Kathy, and it's great to be with you here today. Have you been following along with our forgiveness series? It's been really powerful because, well, truthfully, we've all been hurt in life by other people, and we have hurt others. And so it's one of those things where, it's relevant for everyone that we have to continually in this life learn to let go better, for lack of a better way of putting it, and but in the way that Christ demonstrates to us. So it's a really powerful thing when we learn to let go. If you have been away from either our in-person church services, or you can't get around to being at your computer or online watching the services, did you know that we have a audio podcast? You could be taking this on the road, like if you're on a road trip, with your family, and to catch up on this message series would be really fantastic. So look us up, the Olive Branch Markham, to catch up on any messages that you might have missed. So let's spend some time in worship, and we are so glad that you have joined us, and may God bless the rest of your summer.
Thousand generations falling down in worship to sing the song of ages to the Lamb. And all have gone before us, and all who will believe will sing the song of ages to the Lamb. Your name is the highest, your name is the greatest, your name stands above them all. All thrones and dominions, all powers and positions, your name stands above them all. And the angels cry, oh, creation cries, holy, you are lifted high, holy, holy forever. If you've been forgiven, and if you've been redeemed, sing the song forever to the Lamb. And if you walk in freedom, and if you bear His name, sing the song forever to the Lamb. We'll sing the song forever and amen. And the angels cry, creation cries, holy, you are lifted high, holy, holy forever. Hear your people sing, holy, to the King of Kings. Your name stands
So we're in week number 4 in a series on forgiveness, and hopefully it's been helping you. This is one of the most important things that you ever learn, which is exactly why Jesus spent a huge amount of time on it, dealing with it, because he knows it's hard, and he knows that we need to do it. And of course, that was ultimately his reason for coming here, was so that we could be forgiven. Now, just a couple of things. I've got a number of books that I've used in this. One of them is Timothy Keller's book called Forgive, which is, I think, his last book one of the last books he wrote before he passed away. Just a great book. One of the books I've used again and again and recommended is The Art of Forgiving by Lewis Smedes. And then there's a great book that includes a lot on forgiveness and so on, and it's called, by Kyle Idleman, and it's called Grace is Greater. And so I would recommend any of these books. But honestly, primary book that you need to be familiar with is what the Bible has to say, because the Bible is powerful in terms of what it teaches and how Jesus taught on forgiveness. Now, one of the things that we would like to do is we'd like to be able to deny and say, it's not that bad, I think I'm okay, and so on. But I'm telling you, I've worked all my life with people. Everybody struggles with forgiveness, and that's why Jesus basically said, let it go. Let it go. Forgiveness is not an option if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, because everyone hurts and everyone gets hurt by other people. Now, you've lived some life so far, so let me just ask, is there anybody here who has never needed to be forgiven by your parents or your siblings for anything that you did in your home? Like it just was, you were the perfect child. Maybe not. Is there anybody here who never needed to be forgiven by the person that you married because you've been the perfect spouse? You've been, the perfect, person to be married to. Any perfect husbands or wives out there? Maybe not. Is there anybody here, and you'd have to say, well, you know what, I've lived a fairly good life, but even the stuff that I've done that people don't know about, things that I've said about people behind their back or whatever, like I have been the person, even if people knew that, I would never need to be forgiven because I haven't hurt anybody. Maybe not. Anybody who, would say, I have no regrets. Like, anything I've ever done, like it's maybe, kind of a misdemeanor, a relational misdemeanor, no felonies, it was mostly B minuses, maybe if it's not a B plus. Like, I've just done this so well. Most of us have regrets. Most of us have hurt other people and been hurt by them. Now, just in case you're wondering about this and you think that maybe God ought to make kind of a special exception for you, Jesus has a whole blanket list of stuff that he said about forgiveness that you need to take into consideration. So I call it the grid of forgiveness, and this is kind of what it looks like, okay? And this is what you can put your actions and that kind of thing through. Like we get our big but, I know I should forgive, but, and sometimes we just need to get our big but out of the way. Jesus said to love your neighbor as yourself, okay? So that's one of the grids when it comes to whether or not you need forgiveness. Jesus said to love God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind. And we were reminded by John that if we don't love other people, then we really don't love God. We're lying if we say we love God. We are told by Jesus to love our enemies, which is hard to do. He says, if you don't love your enemies, it says, then what are you doing more than anybody else? We are told to pray for our enemies. If you're going to pray for your enemies, that means that there has to be an element of forgiveness in that. When it comes to specific forgiveness, Jesus taught us to pray. I want you to forgive me as I have forgiven other people who have sinned against me. And he said at the end of that, he says, if you refuse to forgive, then you have refused the forgiveness of God. Jesus told Peter, how many times do I forgive? He said 70 times 7, 490. And if you reach 490, then you keep on going. You never stop forgiving, because forgiveness is what actually heals the in part of you. And then he said, do to other people as you would want them to do to you. So if you want to be forgiven by other people, then you need to forgive them. So those are they're out there in terms of the grid that we have if we think that we can kind of go through life without forgiving or being forgiven, okay? Now, one of the questions that comes up, and that's kind of what I'm going to center my talk around today, is some of the questions that I've been asked when it comes to forgiveness. One of the questions that comes up is, why should I? Why should I forgive? Well, I answered this basically in the first talk that we had about splinters. Why do you get a splinter out of your hand? You get a big giant splinter in your thumb like I did, Why do you get it out? Because it creates infection if it stays in there, and the pain doesn't go away. It just stays in there and keeps jabbing. So we do this to reduce the pain in our own lives. That's why we get the splinters out of our lives. In his book, Forgiving, which you'll never forget, and that's kind of the issue, right? We forgive because we can't forget. We forgive because we are people with kind of a PVR on our shoulders that records everything that's happened in our lives, and we can't forget. He basically he reviews some of the studies that have been made out there that are secular studies. Duke University Medical School wanted to identify the number one thing that caused people to either get well or not get well after they'd gone through a major medical trauma. And you know what the number one thing was? It was whether or not they were a person who was a forgiver or not. That's the number one thing. Like the number one killer of people who don't recover from major illnesses is unforgiveness. There's another group, and I mentioned this before. They studied a group of women for 18 years. And the persons who didn't forgive were 3 times more likely to die than the other ones. Unforgiveness will kill you, and it kills off your relational world. And the writer of the book of Hebrews, and we don't know specifically who that was, he's writing to disillusioned followers of Jesus, and they're thinking, maybe we ought to just give up on this whole thing. This is what he says: look after each other so that none of you fails to receive the grace of God. The grace of God is so powerful. Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many. So it's not just us, it corrupts other people. And this is kind of my visual for that. I know it's an amazing picture, But you get bitter roots in your lives, and they don't just kind of stay down in there. Bitter roots, bad roots, as Jesus said, they grow nasty fruit. You can check the fruit in someone's life and see whether or not they're a follower of Jesus. Bitter roots grow nasty fruit. And that's what's going to come out of your life. That's what's going to affect your whole relational world. So you have to be careful that you don't miss grace. We receive grace, and then we experience grace, and then we show grace. That's the calling. Grace basically means that even though we are 100% to blame for the problems in our lives and for our sin and for the pain that we've caused other people, God paid for it himself through Jesus Christ when he went to a cross and died in our place and died on our behalf. Grace is powerful. It's the most beautiful thing in the world. And yet, if we're not careful, we can miss grace. And how we live in grace, we aren't called to just receive grace, we're called to give it out. Most of you have experienced what it's like when someone hurts you, when somebody uses you, when they reject you, when they disrespect you. And it feels like a splinter. There's a bitterness that creates in our hearts, and that's when you need to start the forgiveness process. Being sinned against creates anger and frustration and fear in our hearts. And then what that does is that spills out of us and it grows bitter fruit. It creates problems in other people, creates problems in our whole world. If you remember COVID-19, and most of you do, you just imagine somebody, they've got COVID, they've got a head full of it, and they're saying, you know what, I'm just going to kind of wait and see what happens. Meanwhile, they're passing it on to other people, all kinds of problems that it creates. That's what bitterness is like. Bitterness infects other people. Now, there's somebody who wrote me the question. They said, ever so often I am overwhelmed with bad, hurtful memories. He said, they really pull me down. And since I have forgiven the person who caused this hurt, why do I still get these painful memories? I don't want to be bitter. Well, that's our problem, isn't it? We have memories. Like I mentioned, we have kind of this PVR sitting on our shoulders, and it records everything that happens. It records all the events and all of the feelings that are associated with it. And here's what I want to say. Forgiveness is not amnesia. In fact, because it's not amnesia, because we have memories, that's why we need to forgive, because we can't forget. And that helps us to be able to move on into a future where we think less and less about what happened. We get to let it go. We get to, just drown it and let it pass off of our lives. And by the way, You know, when the Bible says that God forgets our sin, it's not like God is up in heaven looking at all the mess down here on the earth saying, I can't for the life of me, figure out what happened because I forgot about it. He doesn't forget about stuff. He chooses not to hold it against us. After first listing all of his past achievements and awards, and some of his failures, Paul, the leader of the early church, he writes this. He says, I focus on this one thing. So what are you going to focus on, Paul? What is it that you're going to really focus on? Forgetting the past and looking forward to what lies ahead, I press on to reach the end of the race and receive the heavenly prize for which God, through Christ Jesus, is calling us. He's saying, I used the windshield to look to the future, to look to what's gone on. He says, I don't drive looking in the rearview mirror. So why does hurt and pain, come back? I sometimes look at the hurt and the anger that I felt and so on, and I look at it like a glass with water in it. And so you pour water in this cup, okay, and you find out, okay, there's all this dirt down on the bottom and so on. So what do you do about that? I mean, you just wait until it settles down again and then drink it? No. What you want to do is you want to pour it out. Now, what I find that if I do that, there's still dirt down on the bottom, and I pour more water in it, and then, kind of swish it around and dump it out again, and then pour more water in it. And over time, it's only as you dump it out, as you forget it, as you forgive it, that you're able to move on and have something clean that's down at the bottom. And that's the issue. That's what forgiveness does. That's how it allows you to forget it, is it kind of washes out the dirt that gets stirred up by the memories that we have. Now, here's another question that comes up. If I forgive, what about justice? Like if somebody stole my car and wrecked it, am I just out of car because I've got to forgive them? Well, no. There's a whole justice system that protects us and helps us. I don't know if you remember the Columbine high school massacre, pretty hard not to, happened back in 1999, But one of the persons who got killed in this was Rachel Scott. And if you read some of the record of what happened to her, the guys that did this, they first asked her if she was a Christian, and then they shot her and asked her if she forgave and so on, and then shot her again and killed her. It was a horrible, horrible scenario. And her dad, who had his daughter ripped out of his life in this horrible way, he talks about this and he said, you know what? He says, I forgive them. I have to forgive them to move on. He says, but I would never pardon them. There is a justice system in our world that handles crimes like this, and it's because revenge is illegal. We have to let the legal system kick in, and then they settle the justice. When it comes to God, He is in charge. He's the one who brings justice to the relational part of our lives. And he says like this. He says this through Paul. He says in Romans chapter 12, do all that you can to live in peace with everyone. That would solve a lot of problems, wouldn't it? Dear friends, never take revenge. You mean I just got to let it happen to me and I don't pay them back? He said, leave that to the righteous anger of God. For the scriptures say, I will take revenge. I will pay them back. So God says, I'm God. I'm pretty good at being God. Let me deal with it. Because I see their hearts, I know what's going on. And here's the deal, Jesus didn't just die for my sins. He didn't just die for your sins. He died for the persons who sin against us. And he took the penalty for those sins. See, here's the issue. If we don't forgive somebody, then we have to rent them space in our mind. It's like there's this little jail cell in our mind that this person lives in. And if you've been hurt by multiple people, you got like this whole prison that's going on in your mind. And guess who's the guard? If you're going to keep people in prison, you've got to guard them. Somebody's got to stay there. Somebody's got to miss their vacation. Somebody's got to hang around, make sure they get fed and so on. So you are the prison guard. And God says, would you turn your prisoners over to me? Let me deal with them, because I know exactly what I'm doing. Another question I hear a lot, and it sounds like this. Well, I can forgive them, but I can't trust them again. Now, the key word here is the word again, okay? I can't trust, that's good. You shouldn't trust them until you begin to find out what's happened. It's partially right. But it's not even wise to keep on trusting somebody who's betrayed you or lied to you, Pain is kind of a built-in reminder, isn't it? A couple weeks ago, I burned my arm. I was reaching into the oven and burned my arm in a rack. And there's this little red mark there. But burns remind us, be careful when you're sticking your arm into an oven. Pain does that for us. And pain ought to remind you, to be careful if you're going to trust somebody. Mistrust is natural. But here's the deal. If you go on through your life and you say, well, I had a person hurt me once, so I'm not going to trust anybody. Well, that's going to screw your life up. You have to trust people. You have to trust people, and if you get hurt by a guy and you decide you're not going to trust men again, that's going to hurt every relationship that you have. Every mistrust has to eventually be healed, where you have to kind of move on and figure out what happened. Some of you have been hurt by a spouse. Some of you have been hurt by a church. There are people who get hurt by a church and they say, I'm not going back to church again. Well, why? Not all churches are like that. And when you're in any mixture of people, you're going to get hurt by people, and you just have to remember that. Remember what the author of Hebrews says. Without grace, life and relationships and marriages and so on get toxic. And you need to not only experience grace and call on grace, but you need to also live with grace. There's another question that sometimes comes up. And I hear it in lots of different forms. I heard it from a woman who had been, molested by her stepdad. I heard it from people whose lives have been scarred and broken by people who've ripped them off and stolen from them and bullied them in their families. Most current sounds like one that I heard a few years ago from somebody here at the Olive Branch. How do you forgive someone who's promised they love you, left you homeless, and is now in somebody else's arms? I'm heartbroken. I can't imagine happiness. How do I let it go? And I'll tell you, honestly, there are times when I see people experience stuff like this, and I think to myself, man, they ought to burn in hell, But then I think, well, that's what I deserve too, So the core truth for people who have been deeply, deeply hurt is if you don't cut the chain, the anchor, especially if it's heavy, is going to drag you right down to the bottom of the sea. So being unforgiving because you've been hurt so badly, it's like drinking poison and waiting for somebody else to die. So if you drink poison, you're going to die. They're not going to die. And so what happens is if you've had somebody who's done something horrible to you, it's a very heavy anchor and a very heavy chain. And if you want to not get dragged down to the bottom, you got to somehow cut the chain. And forgiveness is the only way to do that. You got to let it go. And they don't deserve, forgiveness. But that's not the point. You deserve forgiveness. You deserve to be able to move on. And I'll tell you, if you feel really, really, really weak, like too weak to do anything, too weak to move on. Remember Paul. Paul is the one who basically said, when I am weak, then I am strong. Because when we're weak, it gives room for the power of God to move into our lives and help us and give us strength. Jesus is the one who tells us that we need to forgive. And when he tells us that we need to forgive, you know what that means? I'm going to be there. I will back you up. If you choose to forgive, even if you don't feel like it, I will back you up. I will be there, and I will give you the power to do that. You say, well, I forgive imperfectly. I choose to forgive, and I still remember it all, and it still makes me mad. Well, we do everything imperfectly. I mean, anybody here who sings perfectly? I don't think so. Anybody here who's the perfect parent, like you're perfect at being a parent, or you're the perfect friend, or you're the perfect spouse? We don't do anything perfectly, and so why would we be able to forgive perfectly? We are all imperfect at doing that. God is the one who does it perfectly. So how do we forgive? How do we forgive things like that? Somebody once said to me in a question, says, I understand that we need to forgive. What I need to know is how to forgive, because I don't know how to do it. Back in 1993, we had our basement finished, and I watched and I helped. And that's part of the issue when it comes to forgiveness. You watch an expert. And the person I was watching was an expert in drywall. So I learned some things about drywall. Drywall compound is really messy, and you put this tape on, and then that's not a big deal. It's not really hard to cut the drywall and get it nailed up there. The hard part is basically getting this, the drywall compound smoothed onto there and so on. And I learned something really good. It's kind of got wax on, wax off. I found that when you sand a lot, like you put it on thick and then you sand a lot, you end up with white nostrils, and you have this stuff down in your lungs, okay? So I found out that you put it on in thin coats, and you keep doing it a little at a time and then you do standing at the very last moment. So I learned that from an expert. So you watch Jesus, the expert forgiver, who showed up and died in our place. So he's the professional, and we're all amateurs. And let me just kind of walk through what it means to forgive somebody, okay? The first thing you need to do is blame them. Like you can't forgive somebody you can't blame. You have to assess the damage. Remember the guy in this story we talked about last week? This king that called all of his debtors in, and he found out this guy owed him 10,000 talents, 10,000 bags of gold. So he knew exactly what the guy owed him, and it was then that he forgave him. And when he forgave him, he paid the debt. But you have to know what has happened. You have to assess the damage. And you don't want to hurry on that part of it. You want to know exactly, have a sense of what you're forgiving, okay? The second thing that God does when he forgives us is that he restores our worth. Jesus came here as a human being. He walked our roads. He ate our food. He knew what it was like to get sick to his stomach. He knew what it was like to have pain in his teeth and what it was like to need a shower. He knew all of those things. He knew what it was like to get splinters. So he lived in our world. He lived our lives. And then he died on our behalf, and he paid the price for our sin. The list of my sins was hung over his head when he died on the cross. He reestablished our worth as human beings. Now, here's the point. Whoever it is that hurts you, you see, they're still human. You have to reestablish their humanity. They are not some, monster who did this. They're probably not a whole lot different than you. Their sin seems awful to you, but they're pretty much the same as you, okay? They're not an evil person necessarily because they hurt you. They are weak and they are frail like you. You sin, you hurt other people because you're frail. They're sinful too. So you can't reduce somebody down to what they did to you. They cheated on you, but so you have to forgive, not in nouns. You're a cheat. You're a liar. You're an adulterer. You have to forgive in verbs. You cheated me. You lied to me. So that's kind of the way it works. Third thing that God does is he surrendered his right to get even. We read in the scriptures that when Jesus died on the cross, that he took all of God's anger on our behalf. Like when he was beaten, there, and they basically shredded the flesh and the skin off of his back. And when he had to drag his cross up to the hill, and when they drove the nails through his hands and through his feet, and he hung there humiliated in front of his whole world, he was doing that on our behalf, and he was surrendering. God was surrendering his right to get even. Jesus took it all. He paid the whole thing. We surrender our right to get even with somebody. We say, I'm going to give it up. This is God's responsibility, and so on, and I'm going to surrender my right to demand them to repay. And then it's then that you can revise your feelings, and that's what God does for us. When God does us, we are forgiven. When he looks at our lives, he sees what Jesus lived, how he lived, the perfect life he lived. And so he revises his feelings. We become adopted. We are forgiven. We end up in heaven with him forever because he loves us. All of heaven throws a party for us. Everything gets revised. Now, anything that's tied up in this whole issue of how to forgive, it's when. When do I forgive? In the Q&A on forgiveness that I once was a part of, somebody asked, is it better to forgive when you don't feel like it, that is right after the incident, or can you wait until you feel like it? My research only gave me one answer in all this, that when you forgive, you don't want to wait too long to forgive, but you don't want to forgive too quickly either, okay? Not too soon, but not too late. See, if you choose to withhold forgiveness and say, okay, one day I'm going to forgive this, but I'm only going to forgive when I absolutely feel like it and I have this rush of feelings in my heart. Remember, Jesus said to forgive from your heart, and that means it's a choice. That's what the heart was the seat of. It was the seat of the will. We make a choice to forgive. We assess the damage. We restore the person's worth. We surrender our right to get even. We revise our feelings, and so on. So that's what needs to take place. So you don't want to try to shortcut this process. But grace is at the very, very heart of this. Let's just kind of say that verse again that we've chosen for today. Look after each other so that none of you fails to receive the grace of God. Often the grace of God comes from us when we forgive. Watch out that no poisonous root of bitterness grows up to trouble you, corrupting many. You wait too long, and what has happened is going to build a root system in you, and you're going to have that bitter root. And bitterness is poison. It's poison, like it will kill you, So you have to be careful. One more thing, don't wait for the other person to come and ask for forgiveness. Because I'm telling you, forgiveness will probably never happen if you wait that. Because there's pride involved in this. There's pride on their part. They don't want to come and they don't want to say, that what they've done to you and so on, and it's just pride. And many times we don't want to go to them and try and make things right, which is also pride. So if you just wait for it, what's happening is you're going to, place your freedom and you're based on the person who hurt you the most. Now, let me close with kind of a review of where we've been so far. And the first part of this is you can only forgive people for what they do, not for who they are, okay? Occasionally, Laura and I will watch, the BBC thing on Planet Earth, you see all kinds of things there, like killer whales. Like they're called killer whales, for a reason. Orca, in captivity, she eats carp and herring and stuff like this. But when she's out there, you know what she eats? She eats like baby seals, with their big moist eyes with eyelashes and so on. That's what she eats, okay? So you can't forgive Shamu or whatever the whale is for what they eat, because that's just who they are. You can't forgive somebody because they have more than you have, or because they have the body that you have, or they have the spouse that you have, or they have the life that you want. You can't forgive somebody for who they are. You can only forgive them for what they do. We live in a world where people are very, very different from each other. God apparently likes variety because we see it all over the place. There's some people who talk too loud, okay? There's some people who talk too much about themselves, Some people bug you with their weird clothes or their choice of music or their choice of activities or whatever. You can't resent people and not forgive them because they bug you. That's not the point. You forgive people for what they do to you, for what they intentionally do to you. That's the only part that deserves forgiveness. And you also have to forgive specifically. Like you can't, God can do wholesale forgiveness. We're in the retail business. We have to forgive specifically what somebody has done to us. You can forgive somebody for cheating you, but you can't forgive them for being a cheat. That kind of gets into the whole thing that we talked about there, okay? Third, sometimes you need to start by pretending. Lou Smedes, the guy who wrote this book, talks about this officer that apparently, beat up his son in front of their house because he was smoking weed and whatever, and he just hated this guy. And then he had to go speak on forgiveness. He said, this is really unfair, Talk to his sister. His sister says, well, that just means you got to practice what you preach, So he's kind of in a grump about this thing. And he said, okay, I got to start. And so, I forgive you, Officer Maloney, for what you did to my son. Didn't feel a thing. I forgive you, Officer Maloney, for what you did to my son. Didn't feel a thing. He said it was about the 30th time that he finally began to have some feeling. He said you have to many times pretend before you feel like it. It's not being a hypocrite, because people who pretend, they actually intend on doing it. People who are hypocrites, they never intend on doing it. They just want to get the credit for it. You have a 3-year-old daughter, who wants to help you wash the car, and she sees the hose outside and sees the windows open, and she puts it in your car, and you walk out, and the car is filled up with water to the steering wheel. And she says, look, Mommy, I helped. Well, you're not going to feel like, oh, that's okay, honey, everything's good. You're going to be angry, and you're going to pay the bill for $1,975 or whatever it is to get the thing fixed, and it's going to take you a while before this will be a funny story. Maybe 10 years, maybe 30 years, you talk about how she filled up the car with the hose. But it takes time, but you have to pretend because she's just a 3-year-old child. And just a side note, most days, showing kindness is an act of pretending because we don't always feel like showing kindness, okay? The fourth how-to on this is to do it patiently, okay? I heard a story of forgiveness from the mouth of a person who gave it and the one who received it. The one who gave it was a mom who had her only child, her only son, killed by a gang member. And she hated the guy. She hated the guy. When he finally went to trial and he got, put in prison, she was glad. She was clapped. She rejoiced that this guy was in prison. But over time, she realized that she didn't have a son, and all she had was just this ugly, unforgiving feeling inside toward this guy who had killed her son. And she decided, I got to do something about this. So she said, I'm going to go and at least meet him and find out what a killer looks like. First, he wouldn't even see her. And finally, she went in and he was able to see her. And she talks about how she met him. And then over time, in one of the next meetings, she decided to forgive him. At one point, she threw her arms around him and they hugged and so on. And she was the one who sponsored him to take the apartment next door to hers when he got out of prison. And they're really close friends. It's patient. It takes time. So forgive patiently and forgive quietly, okay? One of the questions I've been asked is, when you've asked God to help you to forgive somebody who has hurt you, should you go to that person and tell them that you have forgiven them? And my answer to that would be no. Mainly because we're not very gracious at telling people that we forgive them. I mean, tell them, imagine this, because they're already on the defensive. You go and talk to them, and so you go up to them and you say, well, I just want you to know that I forgive you for what you did to me, okay? So, say, well, what did I do to you? What did you do to me? Well, let me tell you what you did to me. And you're going to go on, and can you just imagine a conversation and where it's going to go from there? So it's just not necessarily good practice to go up and tell somebody that you've forgiven them. There will come a time when you're maybe ready to tell them and when they're ready to hear it, but you'd better hear from Jesus on that before you go up and talk to somebody. And then this may surprise you. Forgive intolerantly. Let's just be honest. It's a huge juggling act for people who follow Jesus. Are you just letting it go? Or are you just pretending that it's no big deal? Is God a doormat, where we sin against him and we hurt other people, and he says, oh, it's all good, no big deal, wasn't a big problem, and so on. No. We go and we ask God to forgive us. He says, I forgive you. My son paid for what you did on the cross. Now cut it off. Cut it out. Stop doing that, because it's hurting our relationships. It's hurting you and it's hurting other people. So forgive intolerantly. It is a big deal. Our world is more divisive and it's more divided than it's ever been. We are splintered everywhere. And when you have all these splinters, guess what happens? You get splinters from them. You get hurt from them. Metal music, it used to be that it was just, the difference between rock music, and country music and maybe classical music. Now, metal music has about 10 different genres, and you can fight over who's going to, what kind of music you're going to listen to. Food, oh my word. Not only do you have food, you have people who are part of a whole chain of food. Some people are meatitarians, and some people are vegetarians, and some are vegans. There's all this stuff going on there. You just eat whole food. So there's all these different varieties out there. We can fight over just about everything. Politically, oh my word. And what's going on right now in our world, especially south of our border, and what's happening over in Israel, and what's happening with Russia, and all the stuff there. There's all kinds of stuff that you can fight over. And what this does is this ensures the fact that we are going to have to learn how to forgive. We're going to have to learn how to be kind. We're going to have to learn how to be tender-hearted. This is part of who we are as followers of Jesus. This is who we are called to be, not to go in and bicker over all the different splinters. This in her book, The Lions Club, a woman by the name of Mary Carr wrote this book. It's called Memoirs of a Completely Dysfunctional Family. And maybe you get a clue on that. She tells about an uncle and aunt from Texas who had this massive blow up over how much sugar her aunt used, okay? So this got, they didn't talk for 40 years. It got so bad that her uncle one day went out with a big saw, cut the house in 2 big pieces, planked over each piece, and moved one piece then over behind some pine trees on the acre of property that they lived on. And they lived that way for the rest of their lives. Splinters get like that. It's not like they get better over time. It's not like, oh, well, I made a big deal over the sugar. It's like it gets worse. You find other stuff. They kind of collect garbage as you go along. And that's what will happen in our lives if we don't choose to forgive. Passage here says, help people not to miss grace. Don't miss grace. Grace is the most beautiful thing in the world. Grace is what everybody on our planet needs, and you can miss it. You can miss it. You can let a bitter root grow up, and it will contaminate your life, and it will contaminate all the people that you touch. And to remind them that God has forgiven no matter what we've done, that He's washed us free, that He's made us clean. We receive grace, and then we pass it on to other people. That's what we're called to do. And that's what forgiveness is all about. And here's what you need to know. If you failed, God is not looking for a way to make you pay for it. God is not looking for a way to just stick you with it and make you feel worse. He wishes you well. He's given up His right to get even. Nothing that you do could ever make Him bring that back on you and haunt you with it, because He has forgiven you. He has forgiven your sin, both now and for all of eternity. And the question is, do you know that? Do you know that? Have you truly experienced His grace and His forgiveness and His kindness, and how He washes your life and how He doesn't hold your stuff against you? Have you experienced grace? Do you know what grace is? See, our calling as followers of Jesus is to know grace, to live grace, and to show grace. And that's what forgiveness is all about. Let's pray. God, help us to not turn the most powerful thing in the universe, the grace of God, who made it possible, who became one of us so that we could be forgiven, so that we could be made right, so that we could live in heaven with Him. Help us to not reduce that to just a Band-Aid. Help us to experience grace. Help us to live with grace. And help us to show grace to a world that is desperately tired of all the chaos. In the name of Jesus, the one who gave His life so that we could experience grace, I pray. Amen. So, why don't you practice forgiveness? Practice forgiveness. Find somebody that still, when you say their name, kind of has a barb in your heart, and forgive them for Jesus' sake. Amen.